Why did Ibrahim Traoré plant 7 million papaya trees across the savannas of Burkina Faso? When news spread that President Ibrahim Traoré had ordered the planting of 7 million papaya trees across the parched savannas of Burkina Faso, the world reacted with shock. Papayas, many foreign analysts argued, were tropical fruits requiring steady rainfall, fertile soil, and delicate care. To plant them en masse in a semi-arid landscape sounded reckless, even delusional. Headlines in European newspapers mocked it as the papaya folly of the Sahel. Aid agencies whispered that Burkina Faso would waste millions only to watch seedlings shrivel in the dust. Yet to Traoré, the gamble was never about fruit alone. It was about sovereignty, imagination, and rewriting the nation's relationship with its land. He named the initiative Project Golden Orchard, and his logic was both scientific and political. Papayas are fast-growing trees. Within 9 months they begin to bear fruit, and within 2 years they produce continuously. Each tree yields not only fresh fruit rich in vitamins, but also leaves and seeds with medicinal and nutritional uses. More importantly, papayas thrive in poor soil if given modest irrigation and organic compost. By mobilizing cooperatives to use manure from Burkina Faso's growing livestock sector, and by deploying solar-powered drip systems, Traoré believed papayas could succeed where conventional grains struggled. His goal was not only to provide food, but also to create an agricultural backbone that linked nutrition, trade, and ecology. Planting 7 million papayas meant more than fruit baskets. It meant creating living wells of water and shade across the desertifying Sahel. The gamble was staggering in cost. Nurseries had to be built, seeds imported and cultivated, water points drilled, and thousands of kilometers of irrigation laid. Soldiers, students, and villagers were mobilized in what some described as the largest civilian planting campaign in Africa's history. Critics in parliament accused Traoré of wasting resources that could have gone to conventional cereals like millet. Foreign economists called it vanity agriculture. But Traoré pushed forward, declaring in a national address, papayas are not a luxury, they are sovereignty. They are medicine, food, and trade. They are the trees that will root our independence in the soil. At the village level, the plan inspired a mix of skepticism and awe. Mothers were told that papayas could provide vitamin A and C to combat child malnutrition. Farmers were promised that leaves and unripe fruits would be processed into animal feed during droughts. Youth were recruited to plant and tend saplings, learning agricultural skills that replaced hopelessness with purpose. And as millions of seedlings were lowered into holes across the land, people began to see the campaign less as madness, and more as a national ritual of defiance. International ridicule intensified, but Traoré anticipated this. He understood that optics mattered. Images of women, children, and soldiers planting papayas under the Sahel sun went viral across Africa, creating a sense of unity and pride. Outsiders laughed, but Africans saw resilience, a leader bold enough to gamble on life against the desert. And when the first rains came, watering fragile saplings, green shoots began to rise across thousands of hectares. To villagers who had known only dust, the sight of millions of young trees was transformative. Children ran through fields pointing at leaves, farmers marveled at growth where none had been expected, and families began to imagine futures not chained to hunger. For Traoré, papayas were never just fruit. They were weapons in a political war against dependency. He knew that each harvest would be proof that Burkina Faso could feed itself, and even export abundance. He knew that papaya groves could become oases for wildlife, reducing conflicts between animals and humans. He knew that shade from orchards could allow intercropping of beans, groundnuts, and maize, multiplying yields. And he knew that the spectacle of millions of trees in bloom would cement his image as the leader who dared to defy impossibility. What the world called folly, Traoré called foresight. And as papaya trees spread their roots across the savannah, the gamble was no longer theory, it was reality taking root. The order to plant 7 million papaya trees shook Burkina Faso's political and economic landscape like few policies before it, for the sheer scale of the gamble was unprecedented in the nation's history. Critics, both domestic and foreign, accused President Ibrahim Traoré of risking bankruptcy for a project many dismissed as fanciful, yet he pressed forward with unwavering conviction. The cost was staggering: nurseries to raise saplings, solar-powered pumps to irrigate dry fields, organic composting facilities to turn livestock manure into fertilizer, and training centers for villagers and students to learn how to tend fragile trees. Every arm of the state was mobilized. Soldiers dug wells, students carried seedlings, women's cooperatives organized compost collection, and farmers learned new techniques of drip irrigation. For weeks the land seemed to be one vast construction site, where sweat, hope, and defiance mingled under the blazing Sahel sun. Outsiders scoffed, pointing out that Burkina Faso could have bought several years' worth of imported grain for the same price, but Traoré saw what they did not. Imported grain was charity that bred dependency, while millions of papaya trees were infrastructure that bred sovereignty. Once rooted, they would provide fruit for decades, creating continuous abundance, rather than temporary relief. He told his people, "We are not planting papayas, we are planting freedom." The gamble went beyond economics, it was also ecological. By covering vast swathes of the savannah with trees, Traoré was striking directly at desertification. Papaya roots stabilized sand, leaves added organic matter to soil, and orchards created microclimates of shade and moisture. Birds returned to nest in the groves. Insects pollinated the flowers, and wild animals fed on fallen fruit at the edges, reducing raids on village farms. What began as an experiment in food security soon looked like an ecological renaissance. Villagers marveled as barren fields darkened with humus, and grasses sprouted between papaya trunks, providing fodder for goats and cattle. Farmers who once saw land as lost now spoke of second chances. The political symbolism was as important as the harvest. Images of millions of young papaya trees lined across the Sahel became viral across Africa, sparking debates about whether other nations could replicate the model. Journalists who had mocked the plan began reporting on surprising survival rates of the saplings, with many thriving under solar irrigation. Traoré, always aware of optics, framed the narrative carefully. To him, this was not only agriculture, but a declaration of sovereignty, proof that Africa could solve its own problems without waiting for donors. At home, the psychological effect was transformative. Communities that had been demoralized by years of drought suddenly felt part of a national project larger than themselves. Women, managing nurseries and harvest planning, gained influence in village councils. Youth, once resigned to migration or joblessness, now found dignity as tree planters, irrigators, and traders. Even soldiers expressed pride in swapping rifles for shovels, declaring they were defending the land with roots, not bullets. For ordinary citizens, the project was not just about papayas, it was about belief. Still, challenges were immense. Some regions suffered seedling losses due to pests and drought. Transporting millions of saplings strained logistics. Maintaining irrigation in remote areas tested patience and resources. Yet Traoré treated these not as failures but as lessons. He mobilized agricultural universities to study resistant varieties, tasked cooperatives with experimenting on compost blends, and used setbacks to rally citizens around persistence. If 10 trees die, plant 20 more, he urged. Failure is only fertilizer for the next harvest. The gamble was shocking because it inverted conventional wisdom. While the world advised Burkina Faso to stick to grains and imported fertilizers, Traoré chose a fruit tree that outsiders saw as unsuitable, and by doing so he redefined the logic of survival. Papayas, with their fast growth and continuous yield, became engines of food and hope. Children ate fruit rich in vitamins, families sold surplus at markets, and animals grazed on leaves and discarded rinds. Every part of the tree had a purpose, nothing was wasted. Within the first year, papaya groves bore fruit earlier than skeptics had believed, and markets once empty during dry seasons now overflowed with green and orange bounty. By linking the survival of humans and wildlife, the project created a balance that surprised even scientists. In areas where groves were planted, elephant raids on crops declined, as the animals fed on papaya leaves and fallen fruit. Birds returned in flocks, enriching ecosystems with their droppings and dispersing seeds. Villages that once saw wildlife as enemies now saw them as part of a shared oasis. It was costly, yes, but the payoff was more than economic. It was ecological peace. By the end of the second season, even the harshest critics began to acknowledge that the papaya gamble was not madness, but foresight. Burkina Faso was feeding its people, greening its deserts, and inspiring a continent. Traoré had turned fruit into a political weapon, soil into sovereignty, and ridicule into respect. The gamble was not just saving Burkina Faso from drought, it was reshaping the very idea of what Africa could achieve. By the time the first wave of papaya trees reached full maturity, the gamble that Ibrahim Traoré had taken began to reveal its hidden genius. Across 12 provinces, orchards once dismissed as impossible were now heavy with green and golden fruit. Markets overflowed with papayas. Villages that once rationed millet porridge now sliced fresh fruit into every meal. And families discovered the taste of abundance after years of hunger. Yet the true power of the papaya revolution was not simply in feeding people, it was in how the crop became an engine, linking every part of Burkina Faso's economy, from farming and trade to livestock and exports. Nutrition was the first transformation. Papayas, rich in vitamins A and C, reduced malnutrition rates dramatically. Children once stunted by chronic hunger now grew healthier, and mothers reported fewer illnesses. Schools introduced papaya breakfasts, keeping students more alert and engaged. Hospitals distributed papayas as part of treatment programs, recognizing their medicinal value in boosting immunity. Food security was no longer about survival. It was about dignity and health. Economically, papayas soon created an entirely new market ecosystem. Local entrepreneurs opened small factories producing papaya juice, jams, dried fruit, and even beauty products from papaya enzymes. Export channels opened quickly, with neighboring countries like Ghana, Ivory Coast, and Mali eager to buy fresh papayas rather than importing from Europe or Asia. Trucks carrying crates of fruit began rolling daily across borders, bringing foreign currency back into Burkina Faso's economy. Within 2 years, papayas accounted for a significant share of non-mineral exports, diversifying the economy away from dangerous dependence on gold and cotton. The ripple effect reached livestock. Every part of the tree proved valuable. Leaves were ground into animal feed, unripe fruit was used as fodder during dry seasons, and seeds were processed into medicine for parasites. Farmers who had once struggled to feed goats and cattle through drought now relied on papaya byproducts. Herds grew stronger, producing more milk and meat, and their manure returned to orchards as fertilizer. This closed-loop system blurred the lines between farming and herding, reducing traditional conflicts between the two groups. Where once farmers and herders fought over scarce resources, now they cooperated, sharing in the bounty of a common crop. Social transformation was equally profound. Women, who dominated papaya cooperatives, became leaders of the new economy. They organized collection centers, managed juice processing units, and negotiated trade with buyers. Their earnings gave them independence and influence in households and community councils. Youth, once desperate to migrate to Europe, found opportunities in nurseries, irrigation management, transport, and export logistics. Papayas provided jobs not only in farming, but across the supply chain, giving a generation new reasons to stay and build their future at home. Politically, Traoré reaped enormous legitimacy. Opposition parties found it difficult to criticize a project that had filled stomachs, created jobs, and brought in export revenue. Citizens saw tangible results, not abstract promises. The papaya trees stood as living monuments to his vision, proof that bold leadership could deliver real change. His speeches resonated more deeply because every Burkinabé could look around and see papayas in markets, in orchards, in their own hands. What had begun as a gamble became his signature achievement. Internationally, Burkina Faso's papaya revolution became a case study. Agricultural delegations from across Africa visited orchards to learn how a semi-arid nation had pulled off tropical fruit cultivation on such a massive scale. Conferences buzzed with talk of the Burkinabé model, and scientists published research on how papayas improved soil fertility, biodiversity, and microclimates. Western governments, once dismissive, now sought trade agreements. Traoré used this attention skillfully, positioning Burkina Faso as a leader in Africa's food sovereignty movement. The ecological benefits reinforced the economic ones. Vast orchards created shade and reduced soil erosion, while their roots trapped moisture underground. Birds nested in the trees, insects pollinated surrounding fields, and grasses grew between papaya rows, allowing intercropping of beans, maize, and groundnuts. Farmers reported higher yields in crops grown near orchards, creating layered productivity from the same land. What outsiders had mocked as fruit folly had become a system of ecological engineering. Challenges remained, of course. Irrigation infrastructure had to be constantly maintained, pests threatened yields, and storage was often inadequate. But Traoré turned these problems into opportunities. Universities trained new agronomists, cooperatives experimented with organic pest control, and solar-powered cold storage units were introduced. Each setback became a lesson, each lesson a refinement. The people embraced the philosophy that sovereignty meant persistence, not perfection. The most powerful effect of all was psychological. For decades, Burkinabé citizens had been told that their nation was poor, dependent, and fragile. Papaya orchards shattered that narrative. Children grew up, believing that their land could feed them. Farmers spoke proudly of exporting fruit to neighbors. Women held cash from sales in their hands and realized they were decision-makers. Youth no longer spoke of exile but of enterprise. The papayas were more than trees. They were a mirror, in which a new Burkina Faso saw itself strong, dignified, and independent. By the third harvest, Project Golden Orchard was no longer mocked, but admired. It had proven that a bold gamble could transform not just soil but society. And as millions of papaya trees swayed in the Sahel wind, Ibrahim Traoré looked beyond the orchards to a wider horizon. For him, papayas were never the end. They were the beginning, the engine that would power not just Burkina Faso's economy, but Africa's fight for sovereignty itself. By the fourth year of Project Golden Orchard, the site of papaya groves stretching across Burkina Faso's savannas had become not just an agricultural triumph, but a political statement. 7 million trees had matured into orchards heavy with fruit, and their impact extended far beyond local markets or village diets. Ibrahim Traoré's gamble had redefined the very idea of what an African nation could achieve with courage, creativity, and collective will. What the world once mocked as impossible now stood as a symbol of sovereignty and a blueprint for continental transformation. At home, the papaya revolution had woven itself into the fabric of daily life. Markets brimmed with papayas in every form: fresh fruit, juices, dried snacks, medicinal powders, and even papaya-based cosmetics. Rural cooperatives expanded into export companies, owned and managed by women who had once been confined to subsistence farming. Youth organized digital platforms to track harvests and connect farmers to buyers in real time, blending tradition with technology. Families ate more nutritious meals. Livestock thrived on papaya leaves and byproducts, and farmers diversified incomes by intercropping beans, maize, and groundnuts in the shade of papaya trees. The orchards had become not only a source of food, but a generator of wealth and stability. Ecologically, the project reshaped the landscape. The once advancing desert was pushed back, as papaya roots anchored soil and canopies created microclimates. Grasses and shrubs grew between the orchards, restoring biodiversity. Birds, bees, and insects returned in abundance, pollinating both papaya flowers and surrounding crops. Even wildlife benefited. Elephants, antelopes, and smaller animals fed on fallen fruit, reducing human-wildlife conflict. Scientists studying the orchards noted cooler local temperatures, improved rainfall patterns, and rising groundwater levels near large plantations. What began as a food project had become a climate adaptation strategy, proving that ecological healing and human prosperity could grow together. Politically, Traoré turned papayas into a tool of diplomacy. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as a poor, aid-dependent state, now exported papayas across West Africa, and even to Europe and the Middle East. Trade balances shifted. and foreign currency reserves strengthened. When negotiating with international institutions, Traoré reminded them that his nation no longer begged for food, it sold it. He framed every papaya export as a declaration of independence, a rejection of dependency, and a step toward true sovereignty. This message resonated across Africa, where citizens in other nations demanded that their leaders follow Burkina Faso's example. Delegations from Niger, Senegal, Mali, and Chad visited the orchards to learn the model, and soon small papaya plantations appeared across the Sahel, each inspired by the Burkinabé precedent. Culturally, papayas became part of national identity. Songs praised the orchards as trees of freedom. Artists painted murals of green groves rising from dust. Schools taught the history of Project Golden Orchard as a lesson in courage, showing children that their nation could transform adversity into opportunity. Religious leaders invoked the orchards in sermons as proof that divine blessings followed bold actions. The fruit had become more than food. It was a symbol of pride and a mirror, reflecting a new Burkina Faso. Internationally, the impact was profound. African youth saw in Traoré a leader who not only spoke of sovereignty, but delivered it through tangible results. Global media, once dismissive, began to cover Burkina Faso as a surprising success story of innovation and resilience. Environmental organizations hailed the project as a model of climate-smart agriculture. Even investors who had laughed at the idea of papayas in the desert now sought partnerships in processing plants, export logistics, and renewable-powered irrigation systems. Traoré, ever shrewd, accepted investment only on Burkina Faso's terms, refusing to surrender ownership of orchards or cooperatives. Sovereignty, he reminded the world, was not negotiable. Challenges persisted, of course. Pests occasionally threatened yields, irrigation systems needed constant maintenance, and storage infrastructure required expansion. But these difficulties were framed as part of the journey, rather than failures. Research centers developed pest-resistant varieties, engineers built more efficient solar pumps, and cooperatives pooled resources to construct modern cold storage units. Each challenge became another chapter in the story of resilience. For Traoré, the greatest harvest was psychological. He understood that poverty was as much a state of mind as a state of economy. By planting papayas, he planted belief that Burkina Faso could defy its geography, belief that Africans could solve African problems, belief that sovereignty was not a dream but a practice. This psychological shift rippled across the continent. Citizens who once viewed their nations as helpless began to demand leadership as daring as Burkina Faso's. Movements for food sovereignty, renewable energy, and ecological restoration found renewed strength. Often citing papayas as their inspiration, the orchards became a continental metaphor that Africa, long underestimated, could bloom against all odds. By the fifth year, Burkina Faso's papayas were feeding millions at home, generating export revenue abroad, and inspiring imitation across Africa. Traoré stood before his people during a harvest festival and declared, "They laughed when we planted fruit in the desert. They mocked when we watered seedlings in the dust. But look around you now. We eat from our land, we trade with our neighbors, and we stand proud. The desert has not defeated us. We have defeated the desert." His words captured the essence of the gamble. It had always been about more than agriculture. It was about dignity, sovereignty, and the courage to imagine a different future. The 7 million papaya trees had done their work. They had fed people, healed land, empowered women, created jobs, inspired youth, generated trade, and restored pride. And perhaps most importantly, they had planted the seed of an idea that Africa's strength lies not in aid or dependency, but in its own soil, its own people, and its own imagination. Project Golden Orchard was no longer just Burkina Faso's story. It was Africa's springboard to a new era. Burkina Faso shocked the world when President Ibrahim Traoré launched Project Golden Orchard, a daring plan to plant 7 million papaya trees across the savannah. Critics called it madness. But the gamble turned dust into orchards and hunger into hope. Papayas provided food rich in vitamins, fodder for livestock, fertilizer for fields, and valuable exports that boosted the economy. Women's cooperatives and youth became leaders of the movement, creating jobs and restoring dignity. Wildlife returned, soils healed, and Burkina Faso began exporting fruit across Africa. What started as ridicule became a model of sovereignty, proving that bold vision and collective will can transform deserts into breadbaskets and inspire a continent to reclaim its independence.